There are stories buried deep in the soil of Tennessee, stories that the earth itself seems too frightened to reveal. Whispered tales carried through the night wind, lingering in the rustle of oak trees and the lonesome cries of whippoorwills. Among them lies one name that chills the blood of anyone brave enough to utter it: Mary Ashcroft. The year was 1912, and in the small town of Ashgrove, Tennessee, Mary was a shadow in plain sight. She lived at the fringes of town, near a hollow known among the locals as the Bone Creek Woods, where farmers swore their cattle grew restless and children were forbidden to wander. Mary herself was a girl of no more than 19, though her presence carried the weight of something older, heavier, and far more unsettling. She was remembered by the townsfolk as quiet, polite, and impossibly pale, her dark hair sweeping down to her waist like a funeral veil. But it wasn't her appearance that unnerved them most. It was what she collected. Mary Ashcroft collected bones. Not trinkets, not pressed flowers, not books like so many young women of her age. Bones. Small animal bones at first, those of finches and sparrows, field mice and stray cats, the kind that others might stumble upon and ignore. But as her peculiar fascination grew, so too did the size of her findings. Neighbors whispered about chickens gone missing, strays disappearing, and once, a calf that had limped its way into the woods, only to never return. Mary was seen walking through the fields at dusk with a satchel over her shoulder, her steps delicate, deliberate, as though she already knew where the bones were waiting for her. And when anyone dared to ask what she did with such things, she answered in a tone soft as a prayer, to remember. But remember what? That was the question no one could answer. The Ashcroft family itself had been regarded with suspicion long before Mary became the subject of rumor. Her father, Jeremiah Ashcroft, was a stern man, a farmer weathered by years of plowing Tennessee soil. Her mother, Margaret, had died when Mary was just a child, leaving a loneliness in the girl that no neighborly kindness could mend. Jeremiah kept to himself, and though the people of Ash Grove pitied the Ashcroft girl, they also feared her. Every small-town community had its peculiarities, but this felt different. People swore that in Mary's presence, silence fell heavier, the air thickened, and even the most talkative souls found their words stilled. It was as though she carried with her a quiet gravity, and resisting it meant confronting something you'd rather leave unspoken. What disturbed the town most, however, was not merely the curiosity of a girl with bones. It was the pattern that began to emerge. Livestock deaths that aligned with her walks, sudden sicknesses, and then, in the autumn of 1912, the first human disappearance. It was a boy named Daniel Harper, 17, bright-eyed and reckless. He was last seen arguing with Mary near the hollow just as the sun dipped behind the hills. He taunted her, cruel in the way teenage boys often are, pulling at her satchel and mocking her collection of dead things. That evening, Daniel never came home. The town searched for days, trudging through muddy fields and tangled woods, calling his name until their voices grew hoarse. They found nothing. Not a thread of clothing, not a trace of blood, not even footprints deep enough to follow. It was as if Daniel Harper had vanished into the earth itself. And from that moment on, the whispers became something sharper. No longer idle gossip, but fearful murmurs breathed in tight corners and locked kitchens. Mary Ashcroft, they said, had a secret, something darker than anyone dared face directly. Yet in this quiet Tennessee town, superstition and suspicion blended easily with grief. Perhaps Daniel simply ran away, some suggested. But the knowing looks passed between old farmers and weary mothers told another story. Too much had gone missing. Too many strange silences lingered in her wake. In the weeks after Daniel's disappearance, folks began noticing small stacks of bones placed neatly at the edge of Bone Creek Woods, arranged as if set there deliberately, patterns forming on the mossy ground, circles, crosses, a spiral like the swirl of a fingerprint. Hunters stumbled across them and swore on their lives they hadn't been there the day before. And still, Mary walked through the fields at dusk, the same satchel hanging at her side, eyes lowered, lips unmoving. She seemed untouched by the talk around her. But the truth The sinister truth buried beneath the layers of rumor and shadow was that Mary's obsession was no longer just with bones of animals. There was something else she craved to remember, something only human remains could whisper to her. That autumn, the town of Ash Grove would learn that Mary Ashcroft's secret was not something to be whispered about in kitchens, nor dismissed as the cruelty of gossip. It was real, tangible, and it was growing. For in those woods where the soil stayed damp and the air smelled faintly of iron, Mary was building something, piece by piece. And the bones were only the beginning. Ash Grove, Tennessee, was not a place where things simply disappeared. Crops struggled. Storms came and went, fortunes rose and fell. But people stayed. Generations piled upon one another, graves filling the churchyard like a ledger of familiar names. Life followed a rhythm as steady as the creak of a rocking chair on a wooden porch, predictable and ordinary. That was why Daniel Harper's disappearance struck the town like thunder splitting the sky. Daniel had been well known, not for kindness exactly, but for the reckless charm that often wins over friends and finds trouble at the same time. He was the son of a grocer, one of 6 children, restless by nature, always talking about leaving Ash Grove for Nashville, maybe even farther. His sudden absence, however, rang wrong to those who knew him. Daniel liked to dream of escape, but he wasn't the kind to vanish without a word. The search for him began with urgency. Men gathered lanterns at dusk, their muttered prayers drifting through the cool September air as they pushed into the woods, calling Daniel's name. Horses stamped uneasily at the tree line, unwilling to go farther, and more than one farmer muttered that Bone Creek woods had never been right. For 3 long nights they searched. They overturned brush, dragged the creek, questioned travelers on the roads leading out of town. Nothing. It was only Mary, the last to see him, who might have known. But when Sheriff McCrae rode out to the Ashcroft farm to ask questions, she met him on the porch, hands folded neatly in front of her, calm as the still water of a pond. "I don't know where he's gone," she said, her voice almost gentle. "He was angry that day. He wanted to humiliate me. Perhaps he wandered deeper than he meant." The sheriff studied her, unsettled but unwilling to accuse outright. Jeremiah Ashcroft stood in the doorway behind her, his lined face hard, his silence heavy as stone. McCrae asked a few more questions, but Mary gave little to work with, her eyes lowered, her words brief and even, as though nothing in the world could stir her. Rumors took shape almost immediately. Some whispered she'd lured Daniel into the woods. Others claimed folks saw her kneeling at the creek bed, arranging something pale across the stones after the boy had vanished. More than one neighbor swore they'd seen her carrying bones larger than a rabbit's, wrapped carefully in cloth. The gossips traded these stories like currency, each detail becoming sharper with every telling, though no proof ever surfaced. What the townspeople did agree on, however, was that the energy around Mary shifted after Daniel was gone. She seemed occupied. Her walks through the fields grew longer. She went into the woods at times when no one else dared, at dusk, beneath the pale sliver of a new moon, or even in the thick fog of early morning. She always returned with her satchel, heavier than when she'd gone in. Some children, too young to guard their tongues, whispered of seeing her kneeling in the earth, whispering to herself. They described the strange patterns she left behind, spirals in the dirt, careful stacks of vertebrae balanced on one another, the white gleam of something that should not have been there. Of course, no adult believed a child outright, and yet none could ignore that Bone Creek Woods became a place whispered about in every kitchen. Wives asked their husbands to warn the children, men avoided the shortcut through the hollow at night, and word spread like shadow. Whatever Mary Ashcroft was doing out there, it wasn't natural. The Harpers themselves suffered most. Daniel's mother took to pacing the porch each evening, eyes on the horizon, as if her boy might still come walking up the road. His younger brothers were told to stay close. The grocer, Thomas Harper, became a bitter man in those weeks, his voice sharp in the marketplace, his gaze always turning, always glaring, toward the Ashcroft farm when he thought no one else was looking. But time, as it often does, began to dull even this sharp wound. By mid-October, though grief lingered like smoke, The searches had ended and life stumbled on. Crops demanded harvesting. Shops needed tending. The disappearance slipped uneasily into the past. Except for Mary. For her, Daniel's absence was not an ending, but a beginning. On certain nights, when the clouds slid across the moon and the woods seemed to hold their breath, faint sounds carried on the air. Shovels against dirt. Stones shifting. The cry of crows startled from their branches. Farmers on the ridge swore they heard it, the faint scrape and rhythm of someone working deep where no one worked anymore. And then came the discovery that rattled Ash Grove further. It was late October when a hunter named Alfred Crowley ventured into Bone Creek Woods in search of deer. He was not a superstitious man. His family had lived near those trees for generations, and though his neighbors muttered about bad luck, he considered the woods his own. But when his eyes caught on a clearing near the creek, something seized him with a coldness he'd never admit. There, pressed into the damp soil, was a circle of bones. Small animal skulls at the edges, ribs laid out in perfect lines, a spiral of vertebrae curling into the center. It was deliberate, organized, designed by hands that cared deeply for their arrangement. Alfred swore the bones were clean, as if they'd been boiled, scrubbed free of flesh. He left quickly, and by that evening, the story was out. The townsfolk spoke in fearful murmurs now, less like gossip and more like confession. To whom did one speak about such a thing? Who had the courage to confront it? Only one name repeated at the edges of every fearful glance: Mary Ashcroft. And while the woods hummed with unease, Mary herself moved through town unchanged. She came into the grocer, though never Thomas Harper's store again, to buy salt and flour. She passed through the churchyard on Sundays with her father, kneeling silently in her pew. If one looked too long at her face, one might almost believe she had no knowledge of the whispers, no sense of the way people pulled their children a little closer when she passed. But late at night, when the lantern light in the Ashcroft home flickered low, Mary would rise. And with her father asleep, she would slip quietly onto the porch, cross the field, and vanish into Bone Creek Woods. What she sought there, and why she built such patterns, remained her secret. But the woods, which once had belonged to silence, now pulsed with a quiet, unsettling rhythm, the scrape of bone against stone, the whisper of soil being parted. By the end of autumn, the name Mary Ashcroft was no longer just attached to rumor. It was tied to fear, genuine, gnawing fear. Mothers warned their children to avoid her. Men shook their heads as they passed her farm, muttering under their breath. The Harper family, stricken still with grief, prayed aloud that answers would come, that someone, anyone, would uncover the truth. And though none yet knew it, Daniel Harper's disappearance was only the first thread in a tapestry Mary had already begun to weave. Because when the frost of November settled over Tennessee soil, more than bones would be found in the woods. And this time, the town would not be able to explain it away. November rolled into Ash Grove with a quiet chill, the kind that seeped into bones and whispered of winter's approach. Frost glazed the fields by dawn, smoke curled from chimneys, and the days shortened until shadows stretched long and heavy across the hollows. Yet beneath this ordinary turning of the season, something in the town felt unsettled, restless, as though winter's silence was carrying secrets it was unwilling to keep. The rumors about Mary Ashcroft had not vanished. If anything, they had deepened, firming into certainty in the hearts of many, though no one dared speak of it openly in the church pews or the marketplace. One name lingered unspoken too often in too many kitchens: Daniel Harper. And though his family attempted to grieve, theirs was not the grief of closure. It was the grief of absence, of something unresolved, gnawing. It was in the second week of November that the first proof appeared. 2 boys, cousins named Samuel and Levi Judd, had been sent by their fathers to gather kindling near Bone Creek Woods. The boys were only 12 and 13, full of bravado and daylight, and eager to prove they were bolder than the whispers their mothers fed them. With an axe in hand and a hickory cart behind, they strayed deeper than they'd meant, following the crunch of frosted leaves until the sound of the creek found their ears. "Bet she's out here," Samuel muttered, his voice sharp with mockery, though his grip on the axe trembled slightly. "Bet she ain't," Levi snapped back, though his own eyes darted nervously among the trees. They laughed then, quick and brittle, until Levi froze with a sudden gasp. At the base of an oak, half sunken in damp soil, something pale caught his eye. Not a rock, not a fallen branch bleached by sun. It was smoother, straighter. "Bone," he whispered. Curiosity, sharp as hunger, pulled them closer. With their boot heels, they scraped back the thin layer of dirt, revealing more. A length of bone, long and curved, attached to the rounded ball of a joint. Bigger than any deer they'd seen. They dug further still, the earth loosening quickly, too easily, as though recently disturbed. And within moments, what stared back at them was not the skeleton of any animal. It was the remains of a human arm. The boys ran screaming, the cart abandoned in the frost, their shrill cries tearing through the woods until they broke into the field. By nightfall, the whole of Ashcroft was gathered near the oak. Lantern after lantern illuminated the hollow, faces pale and drawn as Sheriff McCrae and several men dug with spades to unearth the rest. It took hours. The ground gave way reluctantly, releasing what it had tried to hold. At last, the truth rose into sight, a skeleton, incomplete but unmistakably human. The torso was present, the rib cage fractured but whole enough to resemble its form. Yet the skull was absent. The legs were missing. And though many whispered the name Daniel Harper, none could claim the bones outright. There was too little to identify beyond what they all feared it meant. The discovery shattered what little peace remained in Ash Grove. Sheriff McCrae ordered the bones taken to the church, where they were laid in silence upon a canvas sheet. Men stood in the back with their hats pulled low, women wept softly with their faces shielded, and Reverend Collins prayed louder than he ever had before. Whispers soon followed. Who had put the bones there? Why were they arranged as though they had been buried deliberately, yet hastily, missing pieces as if removed for some purpose? Some claimed Daniel's skull was hidden elsewhere, kept for reasons too dreadful to speak. And woven through every fearful voice was one name, Mary Ashcroft. By now, her reputation was no longer only strange, nor solely tragic. It teetered near accusation. It was her woods, after all, her footsteps that carried into those places when no one else dared go. Her satchel always waited, always concealed. Her father, Jeremiah, bore the weight of suspicion as well. He came into town less often, shoulders hunched against the stairs that followed. Yet Mary, curiously, seemed unchanged. She walked through Ash Grove in that same disconcerting calm, eyes lowered, face unreadable, neither ashamed nor fearful, as though untouched by the storm surrounding her. Some swore this alone was the most terrifying part. The Harpers clung to the discovery with a desperate certainty. "It's Daniel," Thomas Harper declared, his voice ragged in the churchyard. "That's my boy's bone. I don't need no skull to know it." His wife, their children, even his neighbors accepted this as truth. Though the sheriff cautioned patience, hinting that proof was still needed, no one in town failed to hear the raw break in Thomas's voice. The burial was a quiet, grim affair. Reverend Collins conducted the prayer with trembling hands, and though he avoided naming Daniel outright, everyone in attendance knew whose spirit they believed they were mourning. The coffin rested far too light in the ground, its weight no match for the grief it carried. In the days after, fear turned sharper. People reported seeing Mary near the creek again, kneeling as though studying the soil. One woman claimed she watched her arranging something small along a log's edge. Another swore that at twilight, she saw Mary holding up a bird's skull to the fading light, turning it gently, reverently, before placing it in her satchel. And then came the most disturbing tale yet. One night, a farmer named John Weaver, returning late from Nashville, passed close by the woods with his wagon. The moon was thin, the fields cloaked in frost. As his horse slowed, uneasy near the hollow, Weaver spotted a lantern flickering between the trees. Too curious for his own good, he stilled the wagon and listened. The sound came first, the scrape of a spade, the dull thud of earth falling. Then, faint but certain, soft humming. A young woman's voice, steady, melodic, as if the work she did was accompanied by a lullaby. Weaver swore on his life it was Mary Ashcroft. Yet what froze his blood was not the song itself, but the rhythm, a gentle, almost tender tune, completely at odds with the terrible labor of digging. He drove on quickly, yet he never told the story without his voice breaking. She was singing to someone, he muttered again and again. Singing to them like a mother rocks a baby. But there was no baby. Only dirt. Only bones. By the end of November, Ash Grove was no longer a town of whispers. It had become a town of fear. Men refused to let their daughters walk alone. Doors were barred earlier each evening. Families whispered prayers before blowing out their lamps, as though words might keep the dark at bay. And Mary Ashcroft? She carried on as always, planning, collecting, walking the woods under cover of dusk. She had learned something in the silence of the bones, something only she understood. The first body unearthed was not the last. And soon, her secrets would no longer stay hidden beneath Tennessee soil. By December of 1912, Ash Grove was a place frayed at the edges. The cold tightened its grip on the land, freezing the earth hard as iron and coating the woods in brittle frost. Smoke from chimneys rose in tense stillness above the rooftops, as if even the air had grown weary of what lingered beneath it. The people of Ash Grove no longer walked with the leisurely calm that once defined small-town winters. They moved quickly, spoke in hushed tones, and cast wary glances over their shoulders. The bones found near Bone Creek woods had changed everything. Where rumors had once slithered through Ash Grove with sly amusement, now fear pressed down like a weight. No one laughed when Mary Ashcroft's name was spoken. No one dared call her strange in jest. Each whisper about her was spoken with tight lips and restless eyes. Her calmness unsettled the most. In the weeks after the skeleton was uncovered, Mary did not shrink or tremble as many imagined she should. She did not defend herself with frantic words, nor cry to the heavens her innocence. No, Mary Ashcroft walked as though she belonged to some parallel world entirely, where grief, suspicion, and fear could not touch her. She stayed quiet, composed, unreadable. It was this silence that drove the town to its breaking point. Thomas Harper, voice hoarse from grief, was the first to demand action beyond whispers. He confronted Sheriff McCrae outside the general store one bitter morning, the frost crunching beneath their boots as townsfolk gathered around. "You sit with your hands folded," Harper spat, his face red and trembling, "while my boy rots in the earth with half his bones missing. What sort of lawman are you, to let her walk free when we all know what she's done?" McCrae stood stiff, his hand resting uneasy on his belt. "I won't accuse a woman without evidence, Thomas. That's not justice. That's hanging a noose on nothing but gossip." The crowd around them shifted, voices muttering, eyes darting between the grieving father and the worn-down sheriff. Harper's fist clenched. "Gossip? My boy is in the ground, without his head, parts of him missing, as though she's taken em to keep like trinkets. You think that's gossip?" His fury found echo in the crowd. Murmurs grew louder. Someone shouted that they'd seen Mary carrying bones again near the creek. Another swore they'd caught sight of her digging at night. The sheriff raised a hand, demanding calm, but the unrest had been seated too deeply. That evening, a small group of men gathered outside the Harper home. Lanterns glowed against the cold night, their light trembling in the faces of those who had had enough. They were farmers, shopkeepers' fathers, and above all, men convinced that their silence made them complicit in something unholy. Quietly, they resolved what none dared say aloud in the churchyard. Mary Ashcroft had to be confronted. The next night, with lanterns and harsh determination, they walked to the Ashcroft farm. Mary had been sitting on the porch, her long dark hair tucked behind her shoulders, her gaze distant as the cold air misted her breath. Jeremiah Ashcroft was inside, his illness worsening that winter, and so it was Mary alone who met the sound of boots crunching against frost and lantern light flickering across the yard. She did not flinch when they approached. If anything, she seemed to straighten in her chair, her pale hands folding neatly in her lap as the glow lit their faces. "Mary Ashcroft," Thomas Harper called from the front, his words ragged with both grief and anger. "We've come for answers." Her eyes lifted to him, calm as ever. Answers to what? The crowd bristled at her composure. Harper's voice cracked as he shouted across the yard. To what you've done. My boy's gone, and half-buried bones lie in the woods you wander like they're your own. Where's his head, Mary? Where are the rest of him? Silence followed, heavy and sharp as the bitter air. Even the lantern flames seemed to strain against it. Mary's lips parted slightly, her voice soft, almost too soft to carry. Daniel chose his fate. Some things don't wait to be taken, they offer themselves. The words struck the men like a hammer's blow, their meaning twisting in each of their minds. Was it confession? Madness? Blasphemy? You devil girl, Harper hissed, stepping closer. You took him. You keep bones like a crow keeps shiny things. You think we don't see it? Think we don't know? Mary did not move. Her eyes, shadowed in the light, held no panic. Not all see the way I see. Not all hear what the earth remembers. For a moment, the men almost faltered. Her voice was not defiant, not vicious, merely matter-of-fact, as though she were reciting the weather. But grief burned too sharp in Harper's chest, and it twisted her calmness into further proof. Sheriff McCrae stepped forward then, his jaw tight, his eyes scanning both Mary and the men behind him. Enough. This ain't law. This is fear talking. He turned to Mary. Girl, I'll not have you answering questions in the dead of night with lanterns and shouting men. You'll come into town tomorrow. You'll speak before me, before Reverend Collins, before the folks that doubt. If there's proof, it'll show. If not, this ends. Mary inclined her head slightly, that same eerie composure never wavering. If that's what you wish. The crowd murmured, restless, unsatisfied, but under the sheriff's hard gaze, they turned back into the night. Yet something lingered even as their boots crunched out of the yard, the sense that Mary Ashcroft had not been shaken, not even threatened. Her composure was impenetrable, her serenity unnerving. That night, though the farm grew silent once more, Thomas Harper swore he saw from a distance the flicker of a lantern sliding into the woods again. The next morning, Mary Ashcroft walked into town. The church was chosen as the place for her questioning, its pews filled with townsfolk too curious or too fearful not to attend. The Ash Grove Church had hosted countless weddings, funerals, and baptisms, but never had it borne witness to such heavy silence as that December day. Mary stood at the front, her pale hands folded, her dark hair falling like a shroud around her shoulders. Sheriff McCrae stood nearby, along with Reverend Collins, who gripped his Bible so tightly his knuckles gleamed white. Mary Ashcroft, the sheriff began, his voice steady, formal. The town holds questions, and whether gossip or truth, they weigh heavy. Did you bury bones in the woods? Mary's voice was calm. Yes. Gasps rippled through the pews. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men stiffened in their seats. The sheriff's own breath caught slightly, but his question sharpened. Human bones. Mary's gaze did not waver. What is flesh but borrowed earth? What are bones if not memory left behind? Her answer was neither a denial nor a confession, but something between, a riddle spoken with certainty. Reverend Collins trembled, the Bible shaking in his hands. Child, he cried desperately, do you not see the sin of what you do? Handling the dead? Disturbing their rest. For the first time, Mary's eyes seemed to sharpen. Her voice, still soft, carried clearly through the rafters. The dead are never silent, Reverend. You may call it sin. I call it listening. The crowd erupted into chaos, some shouting accusations, others retreating in fear. A few men rose, fists tight, demanding she be driven out, or worse. Sheriff McCrae barked for order, his own voice edged with strain. But Mary Ashcroft stood unshaken in the eye of it all, her composure steady even as the church around her threatened to fracture. If she was guilty, she bore it without shame. If she was innocent, she carried it without defense. And in that strange, terrifying calm, the people of Ash Grove found no comfort. For the first time, the town's whispers had turned into open cries. And though the sheriff struggled to hold them back, Ash Grove itself was slipping toward something it could no longer undo. The confrontation had begun, and the true terror had only just started to stir beneath the frozen Tennessee soil. The aftermath of Mary Ashcroft's questioning in the church lingered like smoke after a fire. The townsfolk had expected denial, protest, perhaps even pleas of innocence. But Mary had not defended herself, nor admitted guilt outright. She had stood unmoved, words sharp but elusive, refusing to bow beneath the weight of accusation. And that, more than any direct confession, terrified Ashgrove. In the days that followed, the town seemed to split in two. Some insisted that Mary's calmness was proof of evil, that only guilt carried such indifference. Others murmured that madness was at play, that the girl had lost her mind to grief for the mother she'd never known, now leading her to strange, dangerous obsessions. A small few, though quieter, wondered if the town itself bore some responsibility for turning tragedy into rumor, rumor into fear, and fear into condemnation. Yet none could escape the truth that something was festering beneath Ashgrove soil. And whatever it was, Mary Ashcroft was at its center. Sheriff McCrae took it upon himself to placate the town, though his own face carried the lines of sleepless nights. He assured them that he would watch Mary closely, that he would ride past the Ashcroft farm at dusk, and that should anything more foul emerge, justice would follow. But whispers have a way of sprinting faster than any lawman's horse, and before long, the fear in the tavern, the market square, the church pews had boiled into dark suggestions. "They'll wait too long," Thomas Harper said one evening, standing beneath the yellow glow of the tavern lantern. "And while they wait, more bones will go missing." The men around him nodded grimly, their mugs untouched, their stares heavy. The sheriff's patience was no longer enough. For men like Harper, fathers, uncles, brothers of sons, now forbidden to wander by night, justice through law felt like a luxury they could not afford. Meanwhile, Mary carried on in her strange, unnerving rhythm. She walked into town only when necessary, her steps measured, her face lost somewhere between thought and silence. On the farm, neighbors swore they saw her slipping into the woods more frequently now, her satchel hanging low against her hip. By lantern light, across the field, her shadow moved steadily into the hollow, calm as though she had nothing to fear from the land everyone else avoided. And then, whispers turned once again into proof. It was late December, just days before Christmas, when another discovery surfaced. Two woodsmen, returning from Nashville, cut through the ridge on the far side of Bone Creek and stumbled upon a strange depression in the frozen ground. Driven by curiosity and dread, they pried at the brittle earth with iron blades. The soil fell away too easily. Within moments, their hands revealed a buried form. This time, the bones were more intact. Another human skeleton, thinner, frilier, perhaps a woman. Like before, the skull was absent. Pieces were missing. The bones were brought to town on a cart, laid out in the church once more, while Reverend Collins muttered fevered prayers. The people of Ash Grove stood in silence, their breath misting the chilled air, their eyes shifting quickly to one another. Now there could be no dismissal. One set of bones might be a boy run off and returned by sorrow. But two burials in the same cursed woods? There was no escaping it. Something deliberate was happening beneath the surface of their lives. Mary did not attend when the sheriff and the reverend addressed the town, warning against rash action and insisting that patience was still required. But her absence spoke louder than presence. In the hush of the church, every glance, every whispered suspicion circled back to her. Later that evening, Thomas Harper raised his voice again. "No justice is coming from law," he growled, his hand slamming against the tavern bar. "Our sons are gone, our wives weep, and the bones keep rising in her woods. Are we fools to wait for a sheriff too afraid to do what must be done? Are we to stand idle while she digs through the dead like a crow through carrion?" His words struck like fire on dry grass. Others nodded, murmured, clenched their fists. Fear fed fury, and fury fed the growing need for action. By the end of the night, it was no longer hazy suggestion, but sharp resolve. They would not wait. Meanwhile, at the Ashcroft farm, Jeremiah Ashcroft's health waned. He had grown frilier since autumn, his cough deepening, his frame wasting away. He stayed indoors, his eyes sunken, his strength diminished. Yet despite his decline, No neighbor could claim they saw Mary falter. She cared for him quietly, tending the fire, preparing meals, then slipping into the woods again when the night drew near. It was Samuel Weaver, the farmer who'd sworn he once heard her singing in the dark, who reported seeing her lantern again between the trees just 2 nights after the second set of bones was found. He described her silhouette as steady, her purpose unwavering. What was she carrying? A tremulous neighbor asked. Weaver swallowed hard. Long wrapped in cloth. And it weren't no branch. The news spread faster than fire through kindling. By Christmas Eve, Ashcroft had turned from fear to resolve. It would not be gifts and hymns that Christmas, but the march of boots against frozen ground, lanterns in fists, and fury in voices. That night, while the church bell tolled in the distance for the holiday mass, a group of men, led once again by Thomas Harper, gathered their resolve. They carried no hymns, only ropes, only the weight of justice, as they imagined it. The sheriff, worn from weeks of unrest, tried to intercept them in the square. "You'll ruin yourselves with this," he warned, his voice breaking between authority and desperation. "You'll make demons of your own making." But Harper only spat back, "Better to stop one demon than to lose the rest of our children to the woods." And so, into the night, they marched toward the Ashcroft farm. The world around them was bitter cold, stars veiled behind a blanket of clouds. Frost crunched with every step. Their lantern lighted a chain of fire across the fields. The farmhouse appeared in the distance, a shadow against pale moonlight, smoke curling faintly from its chimney. Inside, Mary sat beside her father's bed, the old man's breathing shallow, his chest rising and falling weakly. She had not expected the sound, boots, many boots, and the glow of light swelling against the curtains. She rose calmly, her face steady, and stepped onto the porch. And there they were, dozens of them, men she'd grown up seeing in town, men whose wives and children she'd passed silently by, men who now stood beneath her with eyes that no longer saw her as a neighbor, but as a monster. Mary Ashcroft. Harper's voice thundered over the frostbitten yard. "You come down and face what you've done." She did not flinch. She did not retreat. Slowly, she stepped to the edge of the porch. Her pale face caught the lantern light, her dark hair swaying in the cold air. "What I've done," she said softly, a single phrase that carried clearly, "is only what the earth has asked me to do." Gasps erupted in the crowd, anger boiling hotter. The ropes tightened in the fists of men ready to pass judgment without trial. Sheriff McCrae, who had followed them out of sheer desperation, shoved through the line of shoulders. "Stop. You'll tear this town apart if you do this," he bellowed. "One more step, and you're no better than the grave digger you claim she is." But the men were not listening anymore. Their fear had grown too strong, their anger too consuming. And as Mary Ashcroft stood facing them, calm, silent, unflinching even before the fury of her entire town, the night itself seemed to hold its breath. Something was about to break. The air that Christmas Eve in Ash Grove was bitter, sharp enough to cut the skin. Frost clung thick to the fields, silence pressed against the woods, and the stars hid themselves as though unwilling to witness what was about to unfold. On the Ashcroft farm, the glow of lanterns bobbed in the dark like restless fireflies. Dozens of them, each one belonging to a man with his face set in anger and resolve. Mary Ashcroft stood at the edge of her porch, her pale figure lit by the shifting lantern light. She looked neither frightened nor surprised to see half the town gathered before her, only calm. And it was this calmness that unsettled them more than any denial or desperate plea could have. "What I've done," she had said to them, her voice carrying clearly through the frozen air, "is only what the earth has asked me to do." Those words hung heavy, striking the men like ice water and fire all at once. For a heartbeat, they faltered, uncertain, was this madness or was it confession? But Thomas Harper, with grief burning hotter than reason, raised his fist and roared into the night. "Enough of her riddles. She's cursed this town long enough." Voices rose behind him, angry, fearful, desperate. Men tightened their grips on lantern handles and coils of rope. They were not here for riddles or reflections. They were here to end what they believed to be evil. Sheriff McCrae forced his way through the crowd, his face wet with sweat despite the cold. "Stop this," he shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. "You'll damn yourselves worse than any curse you think she carries." But the crowd no longer heard him. They were carried by something older, something darker than reason, a tide of fear that had swept through humanity since the first time a torch was ever raised against the unknown. Mary did not move. "You want me," she said, her tone even almost soft. "Then come." It was Harper who lunged forward first, boots crunching against the frost, rope clenched tight in his hand. Several others followed, lanterns swinging, their shadows stretching like monstrous figures across the snow. McCrae tried to hold them back, but he was only one man against many. And still, as they rushed her, Mary did not flee. Instead, she stepped back into the darkened house. The mob surged forward up the porch steps, fury boiling over into shouts. But as the door swung wider, the faint glow of a lantern within revealed something that stilled even the angriest voices. The parlor was lined with arrangements, small, deliberate, and chillingly precise. Bones, animal skulls stacked neatly against the mantel, bird skeletons arranged in spirals across the shelves, ribs aligned into patterns across the table like pale stars fallen from the sky. And at the center, upon a wooden chair draped in a cloth of pale linen, what appeared to be the partial skeleton of a human figure. The crowd recoiled, gasps tearing through them, curses spilling into the air. "My God," whispered one of the men. "It's true," another spat. "She keeps them." But Mary remained unshaken. She stepped lightly across the floor, her pale hands brushing against the bones on the chair as if greeting an old friend. Then she turned, her dark eyes catching the lantern glow. "Do you see?" she asked. "They are not lost. They are remembered." The words sent a shiver through the room. To some, they sounded like madness. To others, something worse, conviction. Thomas Harper, his face twisted in rage, pointed a shaking hand toward her. "Where's my boy's head, Mary?" His voice broke, raw and jagged. "You've got him in here somewhere. Where is he?" Mary met his eyes without flinching. "Your son is not gone. He is with me. They all are." The crowd erupted, fury unchained. A lantern was thrown, shattering against the floorboards, its flame licking quickly upward along the dry wood. Panic burst, tangled with rage, and chaos roared into the night. The house began to burn. Men dragged Mary from the porch, her arms bound with rope as she neither struggled nor screamed. She was silent, staring at them with that same haunting calm even as the flames behind her swallowed the farmhouse whole, consuming Jeremiah Ashcroft's sickbed and all the quiet secrets he had left unspoken. The fire lit the field as though it were midday, red glow pulsing against the black winter sky. Townsfolk gathered at the edge of the farm, women clutching their children as smoke poured upward. A figure stumbled from the house, Jeremiah himself, coughing, frail, collapsing into the dirt. He was dragged away, barely breathing, his eyes wild not with fear of death, but with something else, grief, fury, perhaps even shame, though no words crossed his lips. Amid the chaos, Mary, bound and pulled toward the edge of the field, finally spoke again. "It does not end with fire," she murmured, her voice clear despite the roar of the blaze. "Burn what you will, bury what you must. The bones will still call, and I will always answer." Her words froze the men for a moment, their grip tightening on the ropes around her wrists, their faces paling even against the flame's glow. "Witch," someone muttered. "Monster," another spat. But others trembled, because her tone held no malice, no threat, only certainty. As the farmhouse crumbled into ash, the men dragged Mary toward the edge of Bone Creek woods. Some shouted to hang her, others to drown her in the creek. But the sheriff, breathless and desperate, hurled himself in front of them, his hands outstretched. "You'll not murder her in cold blood," McCrae bellowed, his voice fueled by the last reserves of his strength. "If she is guilty, she'll face trial. If she is mad, she'll be judged by God. But if you put her in the earth tonight, you'll carry that sin till the grave. And this town will wear it worse than any curse you imagine." The mob faltered, caught between rage and reason. The ropes pulled, loosened, tightened again. The fire roared behind them, spitting sparks into the night, its glow painting the trees as though hell itself had risen among them. Mary stood at the center of it all, silent, her pale face illuminated red and gold, her dark eyes fixed not on the men, not on the ropes, but on the woods themselves. Bone Creek Woods. She stared into the trees as though they alone held the truth, as though the fire and fury around her were nothing but a passing tremor beside the earth's eternal memory. Finally, through sheer force of will, Sheriff McCrae seized the rope himself, yanking her back from the mob's grasp. "Enough," he roared. "She comes with me." The men, exhausted, shaken, and no longer able to ignore the sheriff's fury, relented. One by one, their voices dimmed, their fists loosened. The ropes fell slack. But none of them, not Harper, not McCrae, not a single soul in Ash Grove, could shake the look on Mary Ashcroft's face as she was led away. That disturbing calm. That strange sense that she had not been defeated, not even threatened. For though the farmhouse lay in smoldering ruin, the truth remained untouched. And everyone in Ash Grove felt it that night as they trudged back through frost and ash, their hearts heavy as stone. This was not the end of Mary Ashcroft. No, this was only the beginning. The night after the fire, Ash Grove was cloaked in silence, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence that follows violence, heavy and fragile, as though the town itself was holding its breath. The Ashcroft farmhouse lay in ruins, its charred remains still smoldering on the frosted fields. Jeremiah Ashcroft, frail and coughing, had been carried to the home of distant relatives, his body broken by sickness and grief. And Mary had been taken into town, not by the mob, but by the firm hand of Sheriff McCrae. She was placed in the single holding cell that sat at the back of the sheriff's office, a small, drafty room where the iron bars rusted and the straw mattress sagged. McCrae turned the key, his broad shoulders hunched with weariness, his eyes sagging with both doubt and determination. He had promised the town justice, or at least due process, but part of him wondered if justice was even possible in a place where fear had already decided the verdict. Mary sat quietly on the mattress, her dark hair falling across her shoulders in disheveled strands. Her wrists, red from the ropes, rested calmly in her lap. She did not pace, did not plead, did not even raise her eyes when McCrae shut the door. "I kept you alive tonight," the sheriff muttered, his voice low. "You ought to think on that." Mary finally lifted her head. Her pale gaze settled on him, steady and unsettling, though not unkind. "I never feared them," she said softly. "What burns in a house cannot burn in the ground." McCrae frowned, shifting uneasily. "You speak in riddles, girl. But riddles don't clear graves from the woods." Her lips curved ever so slightly, not into a smile, but into the shadow of something unreadable. The bones were already there. "I only gave them order." Those words sat heavy in his chest as he turned away. The next morning, Reverend Collins arrived, Bible clutched, so tightly his hands trembled. He had slept little since the fire, plagued by nightmares of Mary's calm face lit red by flames. He demanded to see her, insisting that sin could be reached through prayer where law faltered. McCrae allowed it, though not without hesitation. The Reverend entered the cell, his voice thunderous as he slammed the Bible upon the small wooden table inside. "Child," he cried, his words sharp with a mixture of fear and fury, "you consort with death. You violate the sanctity of rest, disturb the bones of the Lord's children. Confess your sins and rid yourself of this devilment before it damns what's left of your soul." Mary looked up at him slowly. Her voice was calm, quiet, steady. "I disturb nothing, Reverend. The earth rises, and I listen. You bury bodies and pray they are silent. But they are not. They speak. Always." Collins recoiled as though struck. The fervor in his eyes burned, but he felt an unfamiliar chill climb his spine. In that moment, he did not see a young woman. He saw something he could not name, something his sermons had never taught him to face. "You mock the Lord," he spat bitterly, "and yet you speak as though you are his keeper." Mary tilted her head, the dark strands of her hair swaying. "No, not his. only theirs. When Collins emerged from the cell, his face was pale, his voice unsteady, though he tried to mask it with righteous anger. "Destroy her," he murmured to McCrae. "Whatever evil she clings to, it will swallow this town whole if you let her walk free." But McCrae, though weary, would not yield. "There'll be a trial," he replied firmly. "I swore no mob justice, and I'll keep it. If she's to hang, she'll hang by the word of law." Collins left stiffly, though his trembling hands betrayed him. In the days that followed, Mary remained behind bars. She did not eat much, only sipped the water brought to her. She slept little, her pale face remaining steady, her body still as though she were conserving strength for something only she understood. McCrae visited her often, sometimes in silence, sometimes to question her. "Whose bones were those?" he pressed one morning, his voice worn with exhaustion. "The ones buried in the woods. Tell me that much, and I'll believe you've got a shred of sense." Mary lowered her eyes. "Names don't matter once the earth takes them. They are voices now, not faces." McCrae's teeth clenched. "They matter to their families." She lifted her gaze then, and for a fleeting moment, something sharper flickered in her eyes. They should have listened when the bones were restless. The sheriff leaned back, unsettled. "Restless bones," he muttered, shaking his head. "Lord help me, I don't know if you're guilty or just mad." By the third day, the town was restless. The Harper family demanded blood. Neighbors whispered that Mary was using the jail itself as protection, that she had bewitched the sheriff somehow. Rumors multiplied. Claims that strange sounds still drifted from the woods at night, that the earth near the creek moved as though unsettled. Some swore they saw new piles of bones forming even while Mary sat locked away, proof to them that others must be helping her, or worse, that her influence stretched beyond iron bars. On the fourth day, McCrae was awakened by frantic pounding at his door. Two young men reported that dogs had unearthed something near the ridge. Not animal remains this time, but another human body, partial fragmented, the skull missing once again. The sheriff's stomach sank. Another one, another piece to add to the puzzle, or perhaps the horror. When they brought the bones into town, laying them once again in the church, the fear in Ash Grove surged like a storm. More bodies, more silence for Mary, and more certainty in the hearts of the townsfolk that evil walked in their midst. That evening, when McCrae confronted her with the discovery, she did not deny it. "They're closer now," she said quietly. "The voices. They want to be whole. They reach for what's missing." McCrae's temper broke. He slammed his fist against the bars, his voice rising. "You talk like you know their minds. Are you the one putting them there?" At last, Mary looked directly at him, her pale face shadowed by the single oil lamp burning on the wall. "I don't put them there," she whispered, steady and cold. "I find them. Like you found me." The sheriff recoiled as her words twisted inside his chest. Was she a liar? A madwoman? Or something else entirely? Outside the office, the sound of voices carried through the night. The townsfolk were gathering again, no longer content with waiting. Whispers of another march drifted through the streets, talk of ropes and vengeance. McCrae knew he was running out of time. In the cell, Mary sat unmoving, the faintest trace of a smile on her lips, not of joy, but of quiet certainty, as if all that was happening had been long expected. And somewhere deep in the woods that night, the earth shifted. The bones were not finished rising. By the turn of a new year, Ash Grove was no longer the quiet Tennessee town it had been just months before. The winter cold had settled deep, freezing the earth so hard that plows could not break it, silencing the creeks with ice. But the people of Ash Grove burned hotter than the fires that had consumed the Ashcroft farm. 3 bodies had now been unearthed from Bone Creek woods, each incomplete, each missing its skull, and each discovery driving the town further from reason. A cloud hung over Ash Grove, tangible and heavy, as though the very air bore witness to what lay underneath its soil. Sheriff McCrae, weary and hollow-eyed, kept Mary Ashcroft locked in the cell. Day after day, he sat at his desk beside the flickering oil lamp, pen scratching futilely across reports that could never capture what was truly happening. Yet no matter how long she sat behind those rusted bars, the discoveries did not stop. Bones still appeared in the woods. Signs of disturbances in the soil. Fragments unearthed without warning. It left the town with a question that festered in every conversation. If she was locked away, how could it still be happening? Whispers turned darker. Some claimed she had accomplices, perhaps her father, though Jeremiah's weakening body seemed impossible. Others swore she had bewitched men in town to help her. And there were those who whispered something worse still, that she did not need to be present at all, that her influence stretched beyond iron and stone, that the bones moved because she willed them to. By the first week of January, patience had boiled over. The Harper family, joined by others whose fears had grown unbearable, called once more for action. "They'll hold a trial that goes nowhere," Thomas Harper shouted in the tavern, his voice hoarse with grief and drink. "And in the meantime, our fields rot with bones. Our children can't walk a mile from home without fear of the dirt rising under their feet. No more law, no more waiting. We end this ourselves." The room answered with silence first, then nods, then the scrape of chairs across the floor as men rose to stand at his side. That night, as frost glittered against the fields and the moon cast pale light across the hollow, the mob returned. They came heavier this time. More men, more ropes, more fuel for fire. Lanterns swung in the bitter wind like angry stars, and the hush of boots against frozen earth carried the weight of inevitability. Their destination was not the burned-out farm. It was the sheriff's office itself. Inside, Sheriff McCrae sat at his desk, rubbing his temples as exhaustion pressed into his bones. He knew trouble was coming. He'd felt it growing for days. But when the first hard fist slammed against the office door, his stomach twisted with dread. The voices outside rose, demanding Mary. "Hand her over, Sheriff," Harper bellowed, his words shaking the thin walls. "We'll give the town the peace you won't." McCrae rose slowly, his revolver heavy at his side. He stepped onto the porch, breath white in the cold air, facing the sea of lantern light and hard faces. "This ends badly if you do this," he warned, his voice drawn thin. "You'll bring blood on your own hands." "She's brought blood already," someone roared. "A trial." McCrae shouted back, desperate. "If she's guilty, she'll swing. You know it, I know it. But you take her tonight, and it won't be justice. It'll be murder." For a moment, the crowd wavered, uncertainty flickering in the air. But then Thomas Harper's grief-hardened voice cut through like an axe. "My boy's skull is out there in the dirt while she sits behind your bar smirking. You call that justice?" The shout tipped the crowd back into rage. They surged forward, pounding at the door, the wooden frame shuddering. McCrae pressed his back against it, struggling to hold them off. Inside, Mary sat quietly on the cot, her dark hair falling across her shoulders, listening not with fear, but with something disturbingly close to anticipation. And then she spoke. Her voice carried clearly over the shouts, steady and calm. "Let them come." The words silenced the men for a heartbeat. McCrae turned, staring at her through the bars, his face pale. "They will not end me," she continued, her tone low, soft. "The earth remembers. It always remembers." And then, as though her words had been a signal, a sound broke from outside. A scream, not of anger, but of shock. One man fell back, shouting that the ground near the churchyard had shifted, that bones had been uncovered on their own, pushing through the frozen soil, as though the earth itself rejected their burial. Panic rippled through the mob. Men stumbled, some clutching crosses, others tightening their grips on the lanterns crackling in their fists. But Harper only grew louder, angrier, consumed by grief that would not bend to fear. "This is her doing," he shouted. "Even locked away, she brings it on us. Don't you see? She'll never stop until we stop her." The crowd rallied again, their fear turning sharper. Once more they surged toward the office door. The hinges groaned, splinters cracking, the wood groaning under their fists and boots. McCrae's heart pounded. He could not hold them off much longer. He turned back toward Mary, gripping the bars tightly. "You did this, didn't you?" he hissed. "Tell me you did this." Mary lifted her pale eyes to his. And there, for a fleeting second, something passed over her expression, a shadow of pride, or perhaps certainty. "They rise when they are ready," she whispered. Not when I command." The door gave way then, splintering inward as the mob poured into the office. Lanterns swung wildly, shouts filled the room, the air heavy with fury and smoke from torches. The sheriff tried to hold them back, but they swarmed past him, fists reaching for the cell door. And still Mary did not move. She stood slowly, her figure pale and spectral in the shifting light, her dark hair falling across her face. And as the men grabbed her arms, dragged her from the cell, she whispered once more, "You can burn me, you can hang me, but the bones will remain, and they will keep calling." Her words struck the men like a cold wind. Some faltered, trembling, but the momentum carried the mob forward. They hauled her through the doorway, out into the night, their lanterns blazing, their ropes swinging. The sheriff, beaten and shoved aside, stumbled into the road, his chest heaving, his heart splintering under the weight of failure. He watched as the mob dragged Mary toward Bone Creek Woods itself, the place where it had all begun, the place that now seemed to pulse with a presence stronger than any law or prayer could quell. The cold wind carried her final words back toward him, soft but disturbingly certain. "The bones will remember what you do tonight." And as the mob disappeared into the black hollow of trees, lanterns bobbing like restless fire, Sheriff McCrae knew one undeniable truth. Whatever happened in those woods, Ash Grove would never escape it. The night swallowed them whole as the mob dragged Mary Ashcroft into Bone Creek Woods. The flickering of lanterns became like angry stars scattered among the bare trees, their light slipping and shuddering against the skeletal branches. The bitter cold clung to their skin, but still they pressed forward, driven not by courage, but by dread and rage, emotions stronger even than frostbite. Mary walked between them without resistance, her wrists bound, her pale face unreadable. She did not stumble as roots tangled beneath her feet, nor did she flinch when men cursed or spat at her. She carried herself as if she belonged to the woods, as if their shouts were only echoes against the deeper silence of Bone Creek Hollow. Sheriff McCrae, bruised and bleeding from the struggle in the office, followed at a distance, his breath white in the air. Though half pushed back by the mob, he could not abandon what was unfolding. His conscience gripped him tight, telling him that if this night continued its course, Ash Grove itself might carry the wound forever. The deeper they went, the quieter it grew. The trees thickened, shadows swallowing the men whole as lanterns threw crooked light across their faces. The sound of crunching frost seemed louder, echoing strangely. Even the bravest shifted uneasily. There was something about Bone Creek Woods that had never welcomed the living. Fathers had warned children away from it long before Mary was born. At last, they broke through into the clearing that locals called the Hollow of Bones. It was a wide, open space where the creek curled in a crooked bend, leaving damp, rich soil that never seemed to dry. And here, under the weave of trees and moonlight, lay the proof of every rumor Ash Grove had whispered. The ground was littered with bones. Not scattered, not careless. Arranged. Carefully, meticulously, with a purpose no one could quite comprehend. Rib cages balanced in spirals. Skulls of animals set in tight rings. Vertebrae forming long, deliberate lines that intersected like pale maps across the soil. And in the center of it all, partially buried, half revealed by frost, lay the unmistakable fragments of human remains. The men froze, lanterns trembling, eyes wide with horror. Some crossed themselves. Others muttered curses. Thomas Harper's voice broke the silence as a strangled cry. "My boy! My Daniel! This is where she's kept him." He fell to his knees, clutching at the dirt, pulling frantically at the fragments, as though he might piece his son back together with his own bare hands. But the more he unearthed, the clearer it became that the bones before him could not belong to one boy alone. There were too many. The crowd recoiled, gasps and curses cascading like loose stones. The hollow was worse than they had imagined. It was not simply a graveyard. It was a place of deliberate creation, a workshop of the dead. Mary stood taller now, her bound wrists rising slightly as though she were presenting the sight to them. Her calm face glowed in the torchlight. "You wanted truth," she said softly. "Here it is." One of the men shouted. his voice trembling with fury. "You did this. All of this. You're the reason the bones won't stay in the ground." Mary's dark eyes flickered. "No. I gave them order. I listened when you would not. They rose because they were not at rest. They rose because the earth remembers when the living choose to forget." Her words cut through the mob like a cold wind. Some men shook their heads, clutching tighter to their ropes and torches. Others faltered, their courage cracking under the weight of what they saw. Sheriff McCrae stepped forward cautiously, his boots pressing frost and bone underfoot. "Mary," he said, his voice firm though his chest tightened. "Whatever your reasons, this is desecration. It's madness." Her gaze shifted to him, calm and sharp. "Madness? You bury bodies and build your houses on their graves, as if that is reverence. I only remember them. I give them form when you give them silence." Her voice carried with such certainty, such unshaken composure, that even the sheriff felt his skin crawl. He looked around at the bones, the spirals, the patterns carved into the very earth, and his heart pounded with a mix of fear and awe. This was no child's obsession. This was a calling. The men around them stirred, growing restless again, unwilling to be swallowed by the strange quiet of her conviction. "String her up," Harper roared, his voice cracking with grief and rage. "End this, and let the woods rest." The mob surged forward, ropes held high, torches brushing low branches that crackled with sparks. But at that very moment, the earth itself interrupted them. The ground shifted. At first it was subtle, the smallest tremor beneath their feet, like water moving under frozen soil. Then, louder, a hollow thud, a crack, and suddenly, the frost-rigid ground split as skeletal hands pushed upward through the dirt. Screams tore from the mob. Lanterns swung wildly as men stumbled back, some falling, others dropping their weapons altogether. From the soil, bones surfaced, disjointed, fragmented, but rising, as though pulled from beneath by some power no one could see or name. McCrae's stomach dropped. His revolver hung useless at his side. The bones did not form full bodies, not at first. They twitched like broken marionettes, stacked ribs clattering, skulls rolling free to rest in the tangled roots of trees. But their presence was enough. The men furious seconds earlier now stood paralyzed by terror as the hollow of bones came alive under their feet. And Mary stood calm amidst the chaos, her pale face lit with a strange serenity that had haunted them for months. She lifted her bound hands higher, though she did not pull against the rope. She did not need to. "They rise because you left them unremembered," she said, her voice clear. "But I never did." The bones shuddered, shifted, arranged themselves as if answering her. Vertebrae forming crooked spines, rib cages crossing, long bones dragging into new positions. It was not life, not truly, but it was motion, purpose, the order of memory refusing to vanish into the ground. "Devilry," cried one of the townsmen, his voice high with panic. He hurled his lantern at Mary, flames streaking across the frozen soil. But the lantern shattered harmlessly at her feet, fire licking up a line of bones that caught not like kindling, but as though the bones themselves would not burn. The mob broke then. Some ran into the woods. Others dropped their ropes, falling to their knees in prayer or fleeing in shaken terror. But Thomas Harper did not move. Grief had burned out his fear, leaving only a twisted fury. He pointed at Mary, his face streaked with tears and soot. "My boy is gone because of you. Whatever you've done here, whatever curse you've carried, it ends tonight." He rushed forward, rope in hand, and for the first time, Mary flinched. Not in fear, but in sorrow. "He offered himself," she whispered. The words stabbed Harper deeper than any knife. His fury broke into screams, and he lunged. But before his rope met her neck, Sheriff McCrae seized him from behind, dragging him back. "That's enough," McCrae bellowed, his voice raw, commanding. "This ends now. Not another soul in this cursed place tonight." The bones shuddered once more, then stilled, collapsing slowly into lifeless fragments at Mary's feet. The clearing fell silent except for the ragged breath of men who no longer knew whether they'd witnessed evil or grief. madness, or truth. Mary stood unshaken, her pale hands raised slightly, her dark eyes reflecting the trembling lantern light. "You see now," she said softly. "They will not be forgotten. Not by me. Never." And in the silence that followed, one chilling truth settled over Ash Grove like a shroud. Mary Ashcroft was not creating the curse. She was answering it. Dawn crept slowly over Ash Grove the morning after the Hollow of Bones was revealed. Pale light seeped through the leafless branches, washing the world in a gray, so cold it seemed to drain the very blood from the earth. The men who returned from the woods did so broken, their faces hollow, their voices hushed. Some left their lanterns behind in the mud, too shaken to care. Others swore never to speak of what they had seen. The town itself seemed to absorb their silence. Curtains stayed drawn, doors shut early. Church bells that were usually rung with pride at morning service tolled awkwardly, stumbling into quiet, as though Reverend Collins himself questioned whether his words had power enough anymore. Mary Ashcroft did not return to her father's ruined farm. She was dragged back to the sheriff's office, wrists bound, dirt and frost clinging to her dress. But she walked calmly, serenely, her dark hair catching the pale morning light. Where others trembled, she drifted as steady as a shadow. Sheriff McCrae kept her locked in a cell as the town tried to reach agreement on what should be done. The Reverend called for her death, insisting that evil must be rooted out by fire and rope. Thomas Harper, gaunt from grief, demanded blood, his voice ragged with loss. But others, though shaken to their core, could not bring themselves to demand it aloud. They had seen the bones move. They had seen the hollow swirl with life that should not have been. Killing Mary Ashcroft, they feared, might not end what had begun. McCrae himself stood at the center of a storm, battered by both sides. He had seen her calm amidst the chaos, her words twisting through the crowd like threads tying fear to fascination. He had seen bones stir beneath the frost in ways his mind could not reconcile. And though every instinct in him cried that she was dangerous, whether by curse, crime, or conviction, something inside him also whispered that killing her would not bury the truth. On the second night after the Hollow, Jeremiah Ashcroft died. The frail man, who had been clinging to life, breathed his last in a bed not his own, his chest rattling out a shallow farewell. His passing should have been a quiet matter, the natural close of a life long spent in toil. Yet when word spread, unease swept through Ash Grove like bitter smoke. If Mary had been her father's keeper all those months, quietly tending his illness, what did his death mean for her resolve? What did it free her to do? At dawn, McCrae unlocked the church so that Jeremiah might be laid to rest. But when the coffin was lowered into the ground, many eyes turned not toward the grave, but toward Mary, who stood shackled beneath lantern light. Her pale face betrayed no grief, no trembling, only silence. When the last prayer fell into the earth, she whispered softly, "He will not be forgotten." The townsfolk shifted uneasily. No one asked her what she meant. That evening, Thomas Harper stormed the sheriff's office with a small band of men. His face was pale with sleeplessness, his grief now sharpened into something cold and relentless. "If you will not hang her," he told McCrae, voice low, "then the blood is on your hands. You saw it, Sheriff. Don't tell me you didn't. Bones don't move on their own." McCrae stared at him across the desk, eyes ringed in shadow. "I saw fear make fools of men. I saw grief drown every ounce of reason. But you lay a rope around a girl's neck without law. Harper, you damned this town worse than any bones in the soil." The two men locked eyes, but no resolution came. Harper left, fury trembling in his fists. By the third night, the woods shifted again. Farmers swore the frost near Bone Creek cracked from beneath, as though the soil itself was restless. New bones surfaced in the ridge, smaller ones, animal bones this time, but arranged in patterns not unlike those inside the Ashcroft house before it burned. Men laid the blame squarely on Mary. "She don't need to be in the woods," Samuel Weaver muttered in the tavern. "She carries it with her. It's in her blood." The town could not look away anymore. Something had to be done. And so, on the morning of January 5th, Mary Ashcroft was brought into the church for the last time. The pews filled, the Reverend gripping his Bible as tightly as if he feared it might slip away. Women held their children close. Men stood in silence, faces locked like stone. McCrae escorted her down the aisle, the chains at her wrists rattling softly. She moved with calm dignity, each step measured, her dark hair falling like a shroud around her pale face. When she reached the front, she turned to the crowd, not with defiance, not with pleading, but with the same quiet certainty that had haunted them all winter. "You seek to rid yourselves of me," she said, her soft voice carrying in the silence. "But I am not your curse. I am only your witness." Her words struck the church heavy as a hammer. Some men shouted for her silence. Others bowed their heads, unwilling to meet her eyes. Reverend Collins pounded his fist upon the pulpit. "You are no witness, child. You are blasphemy. You handle death as though it were clay for your hands. You disturb what the Lord himself commands to rest. And for that there can be no forgiveness." Mary turned her eyes toward him gently, almost with sorrow. "Forgiveness is for the living, Reverend. The dead ask only to be remembered." Murmurs filled the pews. Grief, horror, fear, they swelled and crackled in the air until the moment could barely hold itself together. It was Thomas Harper who broke it. His voice cracked as he rose, his grief sharper than any sermon. "My boy is dead," he choked, tears streaking his cheeks. "And all you can give me are riddles. You say you remember him? Then bring him back to me. Bring Daniel back." Mary's gaze softened. For the first time, her voice trembled, though just barely. "I cannot bring back what is gone," she whispered. "I only keep what others choose to bury and forget. The bones stay silent with you. With me they speak." Harper collapsed back into his seat, shaking, sobbing into his calloused hands. The church swelled with unsettled murmurings, but no man moved forward to end her. Not yet. Sheriff McCrae saw what no one else would admit aloud. Ash Grove was broken, not by Mary Ashcroft, but by what she had forced them to face. The bones beneath their feet, the earth's quiet memory, the truth that the dead never entirely went away. For another day, she was held, locked behind iron bars. And that night, McCrae himself sat across from her once more, the oil lamp flickering between them. "Mary," he said softly, his voice worn, "tell me plain. Did you kill them? Daniel Harper? The woman's bones we found? The others?" She looked at him, pale and unwavering. After a long silence, she answered, "No." Something in him believed her even as logic tugged him elsewhere. "But you know who did," he pressed. Mary lowered her eyes. Her voice fell almost to a whisper. "The earth keeps all secrets, Sheriff, even the ones the living will not confess." That was the last conversation they ever shared. By vote of the people, and under the trembling guidance of Reverend Collins, Mary Ashcroft was sentenced. She would hang at sunrise. McCrae, though his heart rebelled, could not save her from a town unwilling to let her live any longer. And yet, when the sun bled over the hills the next morning, and the gallows stood tall in the frozen square, Mary Ashcroft was gone. The cell was locked, the straw bed undisturbed. The chains lay neatly coiled upon the floor. But the girl who had collected bones had vanished, as if the earth itself had claimed her back. Panic rattled the town. Search parties scoured the fields, the woods, the hollow itself. But no trace of her was ever found. Only one thing remained. At the center of the clearing in Bone Creek Woods, where bones once rose and stirred, someone found a spiral laid fresh in the frost. Small, delicate, made from the vertebrae of a bird. At its center sat a single human tooth, gleaming pale in the weak sunlight. The people of Ash Grove never spoke Mary Ashcroft's name aloud again. But when winter gave way to spring, and spring to summer, farmers whispered of strange disturbances in their fields. Unearthed skulls, ribs curling through soil no one had touched. And at night, near Bone Creek Woods, the wind sometimes carried the faintest sound. Not screams, not cries, but the low murmur of a girl's voice, soft, patient, steady, as if she were still there, listening and remembering.
Every family hides secrets, some so dark they should never see the light of day. Here, we open the doors to those shadowed pasts, uncovering hidden crimes, silent pacts, and stories that echo like ghosts through the halls of memory. If you've made it this far, it means you also carry that forbidden curiosity. So don't hesitate. Subscribe to the channel now, turn on the bell, and follow our next revelations. Because every day, new secrets emerge, and only those who dare to face the truth remain to hear them.